let's get into Deep Purple a little bit.
Yeah, so he was a founding member of Deep Purple. He was in Deep Purple Mark One.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
uh, Deep Purple Mark One, Mark Two, and Mark Three is where Richie was. And Mark One, they had 3 albums out. They were much more of a trippy psychedelic rock band in the Mark One version of the band. They had the hit with Hush, which they didn't write, but it became a hit. Um, the first Deep Purple album is a bunch of covers, mostly. They have some other stuff on there, but there's like a version of the Beatles' Help.
It's shades of Deep Purple, right?
Yep, Shades of Deep Purple. And then they had the Book of Taliesin, which was the second album. And then they had a third album called Deep Purple, which there's a really cool track on that called April. It's a long 12-minute experimental track. Mostly this stuff, there are people who like it. There are people who still enjoy Mark One Deep Purple. But the Deep Purple that we know and love and that became famous was the Mark II Deep Purple. And what happened there was, and Richie's been honest about this, he was listening to Led Zeppelin, and he thought they had done a great job making a new path for heavy rock in a way that had, let's be honest, Led Zeppelin was a game changer, and the way it sounded and the way it was being presented was a game changer. It was a new direction past what you were getting with Cream and with Hendrix and with the Yardbirds. It was another level. And Richie thought that Deep Purple could do that kind of music if they got a better singer. And they found the better singer in Ian Gillan. And Ian Gillan's bandmate, Roger Glover, was the bass player. And they got those two guys in and sacked Rod Evans and Nick Simper from Mark One. And true to form, you have a singer like Ian Gillan, you can pretty much, young Ian Gillan could do everything Robert Plant was doing and more.
That guy had a voice, man. Just
Pipes like you would not believe. Absolutely. One of the best singers of all time, clearly on a level with anyone you want to mention. So that opened the door for them to do heavy rock. And at that time, they had just, the other thing that they had done was the album for Deep Purple for orchestra and concerto or whatever it was. It was John Lord's classical piece that he had written. It had given them some stature in terms of credibility amongst the critics. They had gone and played with an orchestra. And they had done this classical piece because it was John Lord's baby, and they wanted to do this for them. They recorded it, and I think again the clips you see from that we've played that have Richie with the ES335, that was from that performance. That was at the Royal Albert Hall, I believe, and they played this concerto for group and orchestra. And then they played some of their rock songs from Mark One. But Richie told John Lord, he said, let's try this hard, heavy rock thing. And if it doesn't work, I'll go back to playing concertos with you for the rest of the time. And fortunately for all of us, the hard rock thing, they did very well. And the first album you get is In Rock, which is an absolute classic benchmark album. In some ways, you could say it was Deep Purple Mark II's best album. Everybody talks about Machine Head as being the best album, and that's an arguable case. You could say that, but In Rock was another groundbreaking album.
yeah,
In the way that Zeppelin One was a groundbreaking album.
You got Speed King and Bloodsucker, Child in Time, Flight of the Rat, Into the Fire, Living Wreck, Hard Loving Man.
Yeah, it's an incredibly heavy, wonderful album. And it really did start setting the tone and the benchmark for, along with what Led Zeppelin was doing and along with what Black Sabbath was doing, for all heavy music that would follow. And then, of course, they did a follow-up album called Fireball, which didn't sell quite as well, but it still was a great album. Didn't have as many sort of memorable tracks on it, but it's a real good album. And then, of course, they did Machine Head, which was the one that broke them wide open
Oh, you had
and made them.
one of my favorite tracks is the mule on there when they do the live shows with
Yeah,
the drum solos and the
yeah,
that they drag out for like half an hour sometimes.
yeah. They were,
Just
you can make the case that they were a very prog band in one aspect. They weren't so much like art rock the way that like Yes became art rock and King Crimson and stuff like that. But they kept one foot in the heavy hard rock stuff. But there was a lot of progressive elements in what they would do, especially live.
how would you what do you mean art rock exactly?
Art rock like Pink Floyd or like
All right,
Yes,
yeah,
where
yeah.
it's it's both progressive and yet it's artsy in its way rather than it's the kind of thing that all the punks rebelled against
Right, yeah.
later. But there was a lot of progressive elements in the Deep Purple Mark II lineup, and then of course you get into say the last album of that lineup was Who Do We Think We Are? The band was starting to splinter and fracture personality wise. The other thing Richie's famous for is feuding with Ian Gillan. Those two didn't get along. There's notorious stories about the incidents between those two. And Who Do We Think We Are has My Woman from Tokyo on it, which is a great track and one of his great riffs. But there's not a lot on that album beyond that song that most people remember.
So conclusion, the two best albums of that, yeah, I mean they're all four of them are worth listening to. But if you had to pick one or two of that
Yeah, I
lineup,
mean, listen to if you have Spotify, listen to all four of them. If you're going to buy them, buy In Rock and buy Machine Head.
yeah, agreed.
And
Machine
then
Head was
if you like Fireball, buy it. But I mean,
well, Machine Head was kind of my introduction to rock music
yeah,
because my
that's the
mom
one.
had it on record. So I was,
Yeah, it's hard to imagine for anybody these days to understand that in 1972, Deep Purple was selling as much as Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones.
wow, I didn't know that either.
Zeppelin and the Stones ruled the 70s in terms of money making, in terms of touring and money making. But at one time in 1972, when Deep Purple were at their absolute popular zenith, they were earning as much money as Zeppelin and the Stones. The difference is they didn't continue to earn that much money, and the Stones and Zeppelin did.
Machine Head's so good though.
It is. It really is.
It's such a great album.
So 73 comes along, and they Ian Gillan leaves the band, and Roger Glover gets fired.
But hold on, before we go there, Made in Japan is also worth mentioning.
Oh,
right?
yes. That you could also say if you're only going to get one Mark II album, you could get Made in Japan. Made in Japan is one of the classic live albums of the 70s, along with things like Thin Lizzy's Live and Dangerous and UFO's Strangers in the Night, and one of the great live albums of all time, and a double live album at that. And that shows the band in 1972, I think, on its Japanese tour, and they were just on top of their game, and everything about it was spectacular. And that album, a lot of those tracks from that album made it onto radio, and you'd hear the live versions of songs on the radio in those days. They, because that album really did showcase a lot of what they were doing.
All right.
It's kind of a best of Mark II live.
It's got some epic guitar and drum solos too.
Yep. And Ian Gillan doing some crazy stuff on vocals.
All right, then you got Mark III.
Yeah. And due to the personality clashes, Ian Gillan leaves. At the same time, Roger Glover gets fired for no reason.
For no reason at all? Or?
Yeah, he did nothing. And first they bring in Glenn Hughes, who had been in a band called Trapeze. He's a bass player and a singer extraordinaire with a very different kind of voice. He could do a lot of the high-end shrieky stuff that Gillan could do, but he had a very soul voice rather than a blues voice, much more Stevie Wonder than a blues voice.
Right.
And then they had talked about trying to get Paul Rogers, but Paul Rogers wasn't that interested. But Ritchie wanted a guy who was a bluesy singer like Paul Rogers. So they actually put out an advertisement looking for somebody. They were looking for unknowns. And that's when they find David Coverdale. And he was a total unknown at the time. But he sent in a tape, and he sent in, like an audition tape, and they heard him and they brought him down and told him to lose some weight and get your teeth fixed. And a star was born, and Coverdale has one of the great blues rock voices of all time, especially back then when he was in Deep Purple. His voice is a shell of what that once was, but on those albums he did with Deep Purple, man, his voice was absolutely mighty. And the first Mark III album was Burn, which is a classic in its own right. Burn is as good as anything Mark II ever did. It's got classic tracks on it. It's got brilliant harmony vocals between David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. Ritchie's still interested at this time. The track Burn itself is one of my very favorite Deep Purple songs of all time. Yeah. It stands toe to toe with any other era of Deep Purple song you want to talk about. And then you also have, some other songs that are classics as well, including things like Mistreated, which we've mentioned a couple of times, which is a big bluesy workout. And that was a great album.
The last jam track, A200, is also great, I think.
Yeah, that's an instrumental, and Ritchie's playing his ass off on that. It's really good.
Burn, the very first track, is also just a crazy display of amazing musicianship. From all sides,
Yeah, and you also have You Fool No One, which is a drum tour de force from Ian Pace, and it's just a magnificent album from start to finish. Burn. It's really, in my opinion, easily as good as Machine Head. You can argue which lineup you prefer, but as an album, I'd say it's easily as good as Machine Head. Then Ritchie starts getting uninterested again. Doesn't like the direction that Glenn Hughes is pulling the band in towards more, black influenced music, soul influenced music. And they do this album called Stormbringer. And Ritchie is mostly checked out by the time of Stormbringer. It's a good album. I like the album. It's not for the reasons I like the other albums. This is where the band starts changing and becomes a little more soulful and a little more funky. And Ritchie is a smaller part of the overall picture on this album. I love the album because of the vocals. I love the album because of the feel of the songs. And when Ritchie does play, it's really effective. But you can tell he's lost interest. It's just not as, his fingerprints aren't all over that one in the same way. And then they go on tour at that point, and they take a band called Elf on tour with them. And Elf has a lead singer named Ronnie James Dio. And the rest of that is history as well.